It's a Minefield is a weekly audio program where we talk getting the most out of life with mental health challenges, with fun and love, to be enjoyed by the whole community.
On It's a Minefield, we speak with well-known and not so well-known Australians about the issues that affect us as we live with these challenges.
It's the mad leading the mad.
We're pretty in sync with each other.
What is mental illness? Is it a result of a chemical imbalance, life experience, social inequality, existential torment? Is mental illness even a useful term? My guest today has dedicated much of his career to asking those questions. Professor Hans Pols is an expert in the history, sociology, and anthropology of medicine. He currently focuses on the history of colonial and post-colonial medicine in Southeast Asia. He has also published on the history of the American mental hygiene movement and the treatment of war neuroses in the armed forces during World War II. Significantly, Hans has a special interest in this history of psychiatry, and I'm keen to speak with him today about that. Hans, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
You have a broad range of interests. What brought about your keen curiosity in the history of psychiatry?
Well, I think it started when I was very young. Right? As Sigmund Freud would say, early childhood is the key. I grew up in the Netherlands, very close to a mental hospital. My father worked at that mental hospital, an outpatient clinic. The mental hospital was surrounded by a large area with trees, beautiful, and I was with my friends there to play, to climb trees, to build huts. But it was great for us that nobody ever went there because the loonies were there. Now, quite naturally, we would always bump into people from the mental hospital, and they were not scary. Well, actually, it was really friendly. And yeah, you could see the side effects of the medication. Many had gangrene, but yeah, they were friendly, nice. There were also very big vegetable gardens where many of them worked. And I guess, yeah, that very early experience made me really think, gosh, what is going on here? The other thing is that my auntie was a psychoanalyst, my father a psychiatrist, so they were always fighting, right? My auntie said, oh, you got it wrong, right? Because you're not Freudian enough. And my father was eclectic, like all psychiatrists today. And so very early on, I was witness to discussions about the nature of mental illness.
Yeah, and those discussions are some of the gutsy ones. And I guess in one way that might be one of the arguments around medication or medicalization and psychotherapy, and where, you know, Freud, who had his really unusual beliefs. What do you think of Freud now?
Well, Freud is someone who brings peace in the room, right? If people are fighting, and then someone stands up and says, but Freud was wrong, then everybody would say, yeah, you're right, Freud is evil. Lots of critique from feminist corners, from so-called scientific psychologists. Now, the really great thing about Freud is he started with this idea, let's talk to people who suffer. Maybe it is not just all biological. Maybe it's life experience. Okay, he's changed his mind about that. Nonetheless, the whole idea, let's talk, I think was a vast progress over what happened before.
Yeah. I haven't read much of Freud, but I imagine, I do know that he got lots of people's stories, and I imagine he was probably a really good listener, and his desire was to make people better.
Well, he at the end of his life, he became very pessimistic, and he said, look, psychoanalysis is a research method. We replace neuroses with everyday unhappiness. But he, in the end, didn't really believe it could do very much. But then he had cancer of the jaw, 38 operations. He had lost a son in World War I. Then the Nazis come in World War II. So that he became a bit grumpy towards the end of his life, I think we can understand.
Yeah. Tell me, the first question I have, as I posed in the beginning, is mental illness primarily a result of brain chemistry or life experience, or what do you make of that stuff?
Well, my answer is eclectic, but all of the above. First of all, there is no such thing as mental illness. There are many varieties of afflictions, right? So if we talk about schizophrenia and we talk about depression, we're talking about two entirely different beasts. So to put them all together is not clarifying anything. Many diseases, chronic diseases, there's a combination of, there's some genetic component, but life experience is very important too, especially traumatic experience in childhood, a really bad start in life that predisposes people to developing all kind of issues later on. So I don't really like questions like, is it genetics? Is it biological? Is it life experience? Because it is then posed as an either or question. And philosophers like to discuss that. It's very much an armchair debate, but maybe we should be Freudian about this and say, well, let's have a listen, right? Let's have a listen to the people who are actually experiencing it. That is much more fruitful. There are many people. I read in the newspaper last week in the Herald, there was an article of someone who suffered from severe depression, and he said, look, the antidepressants saved my life. People say, maybe you should wean yourself off them, but he says, no, I've been happy. This has changed dramatically. Now, does it mean that his depression was caused by brain chemistry, life experience, yet many other things? Who knows? I think we can be fiercely pragmatic about this thing.
Yeah.
If the medication works, fantastic.
Yeah.
But we need to be very conscious that for most people who are going through adverse experiences, that there are many components.
Yeah.
Such as people in abusive relationships might get depressed. Sometimes medication will just kick them up a bit and give them a bit more energy. But if they are not able to deal with that abusive relationship, then in the end, the medication is not going to make much of a difference.
Yeah.
So biopsychosocial, these kind of things, there are so many components. And to call them lifestyle sounds a bit, that word. Scott Morrison said, oh, Aboriginal people like to live in the countryside. That's their lifestyle choice. Well, no, it's not quite like that. Being in an abusive relationship is often not a choice. Often people get trapped. But, and depression is a bit of the easy example of exercise is great.
Absolutely.
Having meaningful work is great. Having a supportive people around is very helpful. And sometimes for some people, medication is helpful. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to figure this out ahead of time.
Absolutely. I mean, I also think that, we're in a society where there's homophobia, there's racism, there's a whole lot of stuff. And a person born who identifies as gay or has same-sex attraction in 1950s Australia and the same person in 1990s, while there's still homophobia, will probably have a different experience of mental distress, and that's got nothing to do with brain chemistry. So there's social stuff too.
Yes, but these social things might lead to changed brain chemistry, right?
Yeah.
People get depressed, that affects their brain.
Yeah.
But the really interesting thing about mental health, and this is why I'm fascinated by the topic, is that it is always about stuff beyond mental health.
Yeah.
Right? Yes, there is personal distress, of course. There is stigma, there is bias, there's exclusion. There are so many social situations that very adversely affect people. Now, homophobia in Australia is fortunately quite a lot less than it used to be.
Yeah.
If you look at Asia, well, there's still a way to go.
Yeah.
Sadly, the stigma against mental illness in many Asian countries is humongous. And the combination of having an experience of distress and suffering that stigma is just awful.
Do you think mental illness is a useful term?
well, we have to be fiercely pragmatic. There are contexts in which it is. It also depends who I'm talking to, right? If I talk to strongly religious people in Asia, I say it's an illness, right? This is not religious. There's nothing to do with demons or spirits.
Right.
So to grab it away from the moral sphere to the medical sphere is a distinct advantage.
Yeah.
In Australia, that's often not the case.
Yeah.
Look, there is a medical component, pragmatically, for some people. The pills are right. We should never do drug shaming. But if we are going to argue that it is exclusively medical and that the pills will fix it, well, no sane practicing psychiatrist will say that. Some research psychiatrists say that because, well, that's their job, right? But we got to stay sane.
Yeah.
In so many ways.
I mean, sometimes I think that it's due to the nature of psychiatry or GP practice where there's simply a time limit that the bigger questions can't be asked. And so medication becomes an easy option. But I absolutely agree that we shouldn't medication shame because the evidence is that they work for some people.
If I may add, some GPs are quite desperate because patients come in and say, I'm depressed, I want this and this drug.
Yeah.
And the GP says, look, I know a couple of fabulous clinical psychologists. And the patient, no, none of that. So the theory that the drugs are just pushed to us by doctors or the pharmaceutical industry is only part of the story.
Yeah.
There's another part of the story that there's a lot of people who, and wouldn't it be fabulous, right? Wouldn't it be great if just a couple of pills would fix it? Yeah, no, that would be.
Yeah.
And of course, in the case of infections, they do.
Yeah.
And it has made an enormous difference in our everyday life. But mental illness is a chronic condition like hypertension, like diabetes. And what we say about mental illness, if you think that term is useful, applies to all kinds of chronic conditions.
Yeah.
That pills play a role, lifestyle changes play a role. And that is our biggest challenge today because the chronic conditions are much more prominent in older people.
Yeah.
We are getting older on average, and we kind of need to have a rethink about, okay, so how are we going to address it?
Yeah. I mean, to speak personally, I call it my words, my diagnosis is bipolar, and I used to firmly believe it was just brain chemistry. And then I did a few things. One was exercise a lot more. One was stop drinking. And the other was finding life meaning. And I still stay on the meds, but I think the other things significantly affected my well-being a lot more. So I absolutely agree it's all of the above. But why do you think? So today in a hospital, in many settings, the head treatment person, the one who's answerable, is psychiatry. Why is that?
Well, there have been a whole bunch of royal commissions and reports about the state of mental health care in Australia. And the conclusions are roughly the same. On the one hand, we have the psych ward in general hospitals that people are either committed to, but you need to have a very severe and serious condition before you are admitted.
Yeah.
The other option for treatment is psychiatrists and psychologists and others, therapists in private practice.
Yeah.
They are very expensive.
Yes.
And they have lots of waiting lists. People who can afford it, fantastic. Now, all the reports say there is a missing middle in between the psych ward and the private practitioners. There's a whole middle. What do you do if you hear voices and someone might diagnose you with schizophrenia, but you get along okay most of the time? The condition is not serious enough for the psych ward. And if you can keep people out, it's the best for everybody. But, you have a lower socioeconomic background, you cannot afford a private practice psychiatrist. And you need actually a bit more than just a session with a psychiatrist every once in a while. In Australia, this was done really well through community mental health initiatives, visiting people at home on a weekly basis. This is called assertive community treatment. As in, you're not sitting in your office waiting till people show up because they want help. No, you're going there to make sure they're all right. Australia was world leading at one point.
What happened?
Yeah, what happened? All kind of things.
Yeah.
Mental health budgets are allocated to health districts who have lots of autonomy in how to spend it. So often the money is diverted.
Yep.
The medical model, which now regulates reimbursement for interventions, favors drug intervention.
Yep.
The real advantage of drugs is the per unit cost of prescribing drugs and taking drugs is the lowest in the world, right?
Yep.
Even though the drugs can be very expensive, but psychotherapy is so much more intensive and takes so much more person power.
Yeah. And time, from my experience, it takes time, years. And if you find a good psychologist, and I've found a great one, it takes a long time, but you do benefit profoundly. But I guess it's a hard sell to someone who doesn't have the money or the time. You've got a magic wand. What improvements would you make to the world to make life better for people with mental distress?
One thing you mentioned before, a meaningful life. Once you feel a sense of purpose in your life, one is able to handle so many more things. And I know myself, sometimes, I wake up in the morning and I don't want to do anything. But hey, I have a lecture to give. I have this meeting, I have that meeting. So I push myself out of bed. And then during the day, I feel better.
Yep.
Meaningful life. Now, that is clearly not a medical issue.
Yeah.
This is clearly a community issue.
Yeah.
A meaningful life is, doing stuff you think is useful, but also being a member of the community, feeling you contribute, actually contributing.
Yeah.
There's a slogan out, follow your passion. Now that is very much a upper middle class slogan, because you can follow your passion if you don't need to worry about paying the rent. So for so many people, this is not possible. And this is indeed that there is more suffering and more distress in lower socioeconomic strata, because you just simply have less control over your life. And a lot of brain power goes into, oh gosh, my car broke down.
Yeah.
If I don't pay my utilities this month, I'll get a late fee, but I can pay for the car. And this can be very complicated. Now, the COVID thing has broken up community. We don't see each other anymore. We don't hang out.
Yeah.
And also, the internet has made us much less community-minded.
Yeah.
We are not going to the movies anymore. We just look at Netflix.
Yeah.
In the 50s, the women's groups held lectures everywhere. And people would rock up because it's the only form of entertainment in town.
Yeah.
It's not happening anymore. Campuses. Students don't look at campus life as a source of community. They commute in, take the classes, go home.
Yeah.
And at the University of Sydney, the Manning Bar, where there's always live music, etc. And if you talk to people who have graduated 30 years ago, they say, yeah, my studies at the university were in the Manning Bar, where we got drunk with everybody night after night. And it was suspicious if you got high distinctions for your courses. People would think, well, what's wrong with you? Now it's the other way around, right? High distinctions are the most important. And social life. Look, I'm not saying that getting drunk with life is the best way of getting a meaningful life. But there is a sense of community that was around campus events.
I don't advocate for binge drinking, but when I started at Sydney Uni, a schooner of cask wine at Manning Bar was $1.80, and if you return the glass, you get 20 cents back. So for $1.60, it was truly a place that you would plan revolutions, fall in love, have conversations with the best people and the worst people,
And have the feeling you can improve the world.
Yeah.
With Amnesty International, Save the Whales, Greenpeace.
Yeah.
Students were idealistic and felt they could make a change.
Yes.
Now, this might have been a little bit of an illusion, but it's a very good illusion.
It's you're such an interesting person, and I just love your approaches and the sort of things you've been interested in. So I'm very grateful, and thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and all the best with the series of podcasts.
Welcome to the segment of the show we call Club Mind. Today we have Steffi and Daniel, who've just listened to an interview about what is mental illness with Professor Hans Pols, and they're going to give us a bit of their perspective and opinions on what they just heard. Thanks for coming along today.
Great,
Thanks for having us.
So it's a pretty big question. What is mental illness? Have you ever thought about what the nature of mental illness actually is?
Yeah, sure. I'd say I think everyone's definitely thought about it to some extent in their lives. Perhaps you could bring it down to an imbalance, whether, yes, chemicals, we're all affected by neurotransmitters in our brains, but there's a lot more to it than that. And yes, our childhood affects who we are and our past experiences and trauma, etc., and even lack of trauma. And, perhaps a disbalance might come up just from a particularly acute or distressing life event, PTSD, for example, without any history. Anyway, the point is, I think it really comes down to a disbalance, where you're not quite. I want to say you're not okay, right? But that's also, it's kind of hard to define. Any do you have any thoughts you want to add to that, Steffi?
Yeah, I think as well, a lot of the thought about it is that it's very easy to see things like physical illness. If someone has a broken leg, you can see it. If someone has, a heart condition, it usually shows up on tests and stuff. But with mental health, a lot of it is really subjective, and you've just got to go by what the person suffering is telling you about. It's really hard to see mental illness.
Yeah. Agreed.
But I agree that it's definitely, I think it's multifactorial, and there are a lot of things that can impact whether or not you're going to get mental illness, such as your genetic disposition, or whether you've had trauma in your life, or if you've just unfortunately been born with a physiology that means that your brain doesn't create enough of the chemicals that you need to keep you happy.
Yeah.
There's like a push-pull thinking about mental health as an illness, like any other illness, like diabetes, cancer, heart disease. But we can't rule out things like traumatic experiences that can lead to illness. And do you think it's helpful to refer to mental illness as being in the same family of physical illness? I think we just do that so that people get more of a grasp that mental illness is out of people's control and it's not so abstract. But do you think it's helpful putting them in the same category?
I think so, for the conceptualization of society, so that people can understand it. Otherwise, you're expecting people find it hard to grasp mental illness as it is, particularly older generations. We're luckier now that we embrace it more, and people are more into self-improvement and self-awareness. But I think if you take away that comparison for people, unless there's another way to really easily define it so that people take it seriously as a debilitating condition, then removing that understanding is going to limit people's, understanding, empathy, and support potentially for mental health concerns and issues.
Yep, I'd agree with that, Steffi. I think it's important to increase society's awareness of the prevalence of mental illness and the impact it has on people's lives. And if that means putting it alongside a physical illness that you can see, then I don't think it necessarily does it a disservice. I think it's important for everyone to understand that it can and does affect people as much, arguably, if not more, than physical illnesses, depending on what we're talking about. So.
And they kind of go hand in hand, right? I mean, with physical illness or disability, you're going to have a psychological factor of it and the emotions that come with it. And often with mental illness, there will be a physical effect, either from the medication or just fatigue from the chronic stress that you're having. And Hans Pols spoke about protective factors like having meaningful employment and a supportive community that help people who are struggling with mental illness. So do you think the idea that those things can aid in mental health recovery makes mental illness innately different to physical illness? Because with diabetes, having a supportive community supports the emotions of the person who is suffering with the illness. whereas having a supportive community when you have a mental illness can actually aid in recovery. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think we're not necessarily sort of comparing apples to apples. Like they are similar in a lot of ways, physical and mental illnesses, but there's interventions and therapeutic approaches that you can take for both. The therapeutic approach to fix a broken leg is not the same as depression. They each have their own approaches, and there are things that can be done to improve each condition, whether it's a physical ailment or a mental issue. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think to what you were saying as well before, Caroline, when you were saying that there are physical and mental components to both physical and mental illnesses, having a supportive community can help both with the emotional and communicative side of it, regardless of what they're dealing with, because say potentially you have someone in a wheelchair, you need kind of society's support and things changed in society to help them with their ongoing life and recovery, but also having the supportive community of someone who has a physical illness with the comorbidity of a mental illness as a result of that, that's going to help with that side of it. And therefore potentially their physical recovery, because they'll maybe feel better and want to do more things or have more spirit to work on their recovery.
Yeah, absolutely. Another big disparity is the concept of taking medication. What do you think about medication shaming for mental illness?
I think it's ridiculous. Considering we're comparing mental and physical illnesses, you wouldn't shame someone for taking heart medication if they've got a heart disease, and you wouldn't just say, well, if you just think you're going to pump better, you will. It's like, no, your heart isn't working the way it should. You need to take medication to help look after it.
Yeah.
It's the same for mental health conditions, which I think is where it is helpful to then compare mental to physical illnesses for society so that people can grasp that concept and not shame people so much about medication use.
Yeah, agreed. I just thought about the fact that, as we discussed, in physical illness, you can see; mental illness, you can't see. I feel like it's a thing of like out of sight, out of mind. It's easier. Ignorance is bliss. It's easier for people to be like, oh, the person looks totally fine. Like it's out of sight, out of mind. There's nothing going on there, and whatever they say is going on. I think that's an aspect of shaming that goes on, whether overtly or covertly, but definitely, I think there's a lot of stigma around mental illness because it's invisible. That's a bit of a tangent.
It's true though, but in the same regards, you can't see diabetes and you can't see heart disease, but if you tell someone you've got diabetes and you're on meds, no one questions it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that's an interesting point. I mean, with diabetes, you can do a blood test, and with high cholesterol, you can do a blood test. But when you're looking at someone, you don't actually see it. So what do you think makes people question physical illness less than mental illness, even the physical illnesses that you can't see? You just take someone's word for it. You got diabetes, I'm not going to question you about it.
Yeah. I'll tell you why. It's because it's more visible, it's more obvious, it's more covert, and it's more quantifiable. You could say, yes, you can absolutely say that mental illness can be quantifiable by various psychological measures. Absolutely. However, it's, our minds are so much a black box that we don't know so much of what's going on. And there was a bit of conversation about Freud in the interview, and he spent a lot of his theories deal with the conscious versus unconscious, and it's like this iceberg that so much of our minds is under the water, the iceberg that's under the water. We just don't know. Anyway, we still don't know, in the 21st century. Steffi,
do you think it could also be to do with the history of mental illness versus physical ailments? Historically speaking, anytime someone suffered from mental illness, it was considered hysteria, or they were their bodies were, what's it called, when you've got like demons living you and such. And so where mental illnesses have originated from to how we understand and view them today has come a really long way. Like it's always been viewed as it's kind of the person's fault, or they're possessed, or there's something wrong with the person, not in a way where it's like the physical something wrong, but like mentally something's wrong. That person's just they're like they've got to go help themselves. Whereas now we've done more research, we've got a greater understanding that there's a lot more to mental health, whereas physical ailments have always been, oh, well, if someone's physically sick, we look after them.
Yeah. You mean historically, people have been blamed, that's where the roots, you're saying, is where it comes from. Yeah.
Yeah.
Could be.
Yeah.
There's also still communities in the world that view mental illness as a spiritual thing. Where somebody has schizophrenia
Absolutely.
means that they are in touch with the spirit world. So there's still a huge disparity between how mental illness is treated in modern Western medicine and Eastern medicine, and then more small communities and villages and less developed nations. So what do you think about the treatment for mental illness being a holistic approach, like a lot more than medication? Like Leon was saying, he stopped drinking and made lifestyle changes. Like, do you think that Western medicine uses that approach enough, the holistic approach to treating mental illness?
I think there's becoming, I'm not talking from the medical side of things, obviously, but from what I can see on the outside point of view is that there is a lot more support and acknowledgement these days of how much needs to go into mental health recovery. I think there's probably there's still a further way to go. I come from a naturopathic background where I have studied only the holistic side of mental health recovery and not as much the medication side. Like, I have an understanding of the medical side. And there is a lot of what I know can be helpful that isn't incorporated into the conventional medical system for support, which could be. But then also from my side in the naturopathic world, I think that people in the natural space do need to give more credit to conventional medicine as well and medication. But in short, yes, I think holistic approach is the way to go, because there's a lot of benefit to people taking medication, particularly if they're in a state where they're not going to be receptive to treatment or therapy without medication. Some people need to take medication so that they can then take on board, your CBT and your exercise and whatever other lifestyle changes need to happen, nutrition and or otherwise. And that can either help put them on the path to doing those things where they might not need medication in the future. But if some people do need to be on medication forever, then they need that. But then doing the other lifestyle stuff and the holistic approach is still going to look after their health long term, and they're going to get more out of the medication they're taking anyway.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's like a positive reinforcement cycle. Yeah. Just to add to that, I do agree with what you just said, Steffi. I think personally, it's really important for medication to be used in conjunction with ongoing psychological therapy, and maybe only in a sort of remission stage, that the psychological therapy, can be reduced to more infrequent sessions. But there's definitely, there's guidelines from the Australian Psychological Society saying antidepressants alone are a suitable treatment for depression. Okay, they do definitely give the option that they can be used in conjunction with psychological treatment, but personally, I think that it just going to the GP, filling out, a form to say, I'm not feeling well, getting prescribed your antidepressants, but perhaps being a teenager, perhaps being an adult, and then without really much guidance and psychological support with that, I don't think that that's really solving the problem. I feel like that's a band-aid solution, if even that. Okay, anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Thanks for chatting with me today. We just heard from Daniel and Steffi sharing their thoughts on an interview with Professor Hans Pols about the concept of what mental illness is. And we went off on a little bit of a tangent. Sorry about that. Speaking more about mental and physical illness and the disparity between them and the treatment of it. But hopefully you enjoyed it. Professor Hans Pols is an expert in history, sociology, and anthropology of medicine. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Greg de Moore is nothing if not curious. He is not only an associate professor of psychiatry based at Sydney's Westmead Hospital, but he's also an avid historian. Avid enough, in fact, to gain a PhD in history after his medical training. Greg works as a clinician, teacher, and researcher in the fields of psychiatry and the history of medicine. One of Greg's many interests is the story of lithium, the medication known as the penicillin of psychiatry. I'm delighted to be able to chat with him about this fascinating tale. Greg, thanks for joining me.
Oh, hi, Leon. Thanks for having me. And I look forward to this chat.
Absolutely. So you spent a decade researching the history of lithium as a psych medication. Where did that interest come from?
For me, the beginnings of the story really began when I was a medical student. And I can say this after many years, I wasn't a particularly studious person at Melbourne University. And I remember that when I did psychiatry and fifth year medicine, I was not the slightest bit interested in psychiatry.
Right.
And so I didn't turn up to any tutorials or lectures for 8 weeks.
Yeah.
And then as my usual want, in the week before the exam, I thought I should learn something. So I went along to my first tutorial. And I'll never forget, the tutor looked down at me and he said, "Who the hell are you?" And I tried to explain my way out of it, that somehow I'd been coming along every week. But he punished me. See, he knew that I'd not turned up for 2 months.
Yep.
And he said I had to stay back and interview my first patient. And that night I saw a young man who was 22, same as my age.
Mm-hmm.
He had his first episode of what was schizophrenia. And
Mm.
but that moment, Leon, struck me in a way that no other experience had struck me in 5 years of medicine. And I could not have anticipated it. I remember thinking, I'm going to be a psychiatrist. And
Wow.
that's really what happened. And the next day I turned up to Royal Melbourne Hospital and I went to the library probably for the first time in 5 years. And I remember very clearly, I pulled down a slim volume from the psychiatry shelves and it was called Mending the Mind.
Right.
And it was a short book on the history of the psychiatry written by John Cade. And in it, there was a small chapter about the discovery of lithium.
Ah.
You may or may not know this, that Cade didn't actually mention in this history that he wrote that he was the person who discovered lithium in the 1940s for bipolar disorder. But I do remember at that point, and I can almost remember exactly where I was sitting, thinking, this is a remarkable story.
Yeah. That in itself is a remarkable story. The fact that you had bludged in medical school, but that one moment with that 22-year-old really opened your eyes enough to actually go to the library and happen across this book. So tell me about John Cade.
John Cade himself was an understated man. So he was born into a family of doctors and chemists, with a long British tradition, and brought out to Australia. Cade himself was born in 1912. And it's a time, of course, when there wasn't a lot going on in terms of psychiatric therapy.
Mm.
His father was also, for a long period of time, an asylum doctor. So Cade's born in 1912. He's brought up in various places, but I think in his upbringing, if I could highlight one thing, when he was 8, so the year's 1920, his father took John and the whole family to Beechworth, which is this lovely town in the northeast corner of Victoria.
Yeah.
In Beechworth, there's this massive psychiatric hospital. And young John Cade was there for 2 years of his life, between the age of 8 and 10. And I think it had a profound impact on the way he viewed the mentally ill. And he got to see the mentally ill first as people, and secondly, as a constellation of psychiatric signs and symptoms, which is often the opposite way with many doctors. I think that was because he was immersed in their lives. So he got to see all these different dimensions of their life. And I just think that humanity stayed with him really through to the end of his professional career.
Yeah. So it's those experiences like your own, where with personal experience of people with diagnosed mental illness, that really gave him a passion and an interest. What did he do with that interest?
He initially wanted to be a pediatrician. So he went to the Royal Children's Hospital. He developed bilateral pneumonia. We're talking now the mid-1930s, almost died. But as he recovered from that, he went through some sort of epiphany, and he decided to ditch being a paediatrician and decided to follow a career in asylum psychiatry. So he briefly went to Beechworth. This is just before World War II. And of course, we're talking about the late 1930s now. He was up in Beechworth, and of course, there were no effective medications at all, or World War II. A very crude form of shock therapy, ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, had just begun overseas, though the first ECT machine didn't really come into operation in Australia until early during World War II. So he's up in Beechworth before the war, and then sometime after the war starts, he enlists and he goes off to fight the Japanese, and he spends a period of time in Singapore and Malaya. The Japanese attack, and then he is captured and incarcerated and spends 3.5 hideous years in Changi prisoner of war camp. And there are many things I can say about that, but I'll just focus on the psychiatric aspect. When we did the research for his biography, we were staggered, because this had never been found before. We were staggered to find out that in the midst of this Southeast Asian jungle prisoner of war camp, they set up a psychiatry ward.
Really?
A 10-bed psychiatry ward, which he managed.
Wow.
And it seems to be that his experiences in this wartime environment helped shape what he did when he came back to Melbourne when he discovered lithium. And I think the key thing is this. In that time from 42 to 45, whilst he was a prisoner of war, there were patients there, prisoner of war patients who were depressed, manic, psychotic, delusions, hallucinations. And sometimes that was a result of their physical state due to, for example, perhaps a vitamin deficiency or a head injury, which kind of mimicked a psychiatric illness. We don't know the exact role of this in terms of shaping his thinking, but what seems to have happened is that over this period of time, he started to think of psychiatric illness in the same way we might think of a physical illness, that there might be a physical cause, a problem with brain cells and how they function. And he's clearly got some ideas he wants to put to the test. So he comes back to Melbourne, and he's got 2 young children, his wife's there, and he starts working in a small mental hospital on the northern outskirts of Melbourne, Bundoora Mental Hospital. And whilst he's there, he starts to do a series of experiments, which frankly, even to this day, Leon, are quite bizarre.
Tell me about them.
He starts collecting urine from all the patients in Bundoora Mental Hospital, and then he dutifully collects the urine and brings them home to the family fridge. And when I was writing the book, I asked his children, who were all now retired and adults, of course, whether they thought it was odd that their father was putting bottles of urine in the family fridge. Because I'd come home and they'd be looking for the Vegemite, they'd have to push aside Mr. Smith's urine. And they said, Greg, no, we actually just thought everyone's dad collected bottles of urine and stuck it there. So he then starts drawing up the urine into a syringe and injecting them into guinea pigs, real guinea pigs, little animals, to see if the urine from patients with bipolar disorder are different to urine from other patients. And through a series of experiments, he wondered if a substance in the urine called uric acid, it's an acid, it's a chemical. He wondered if somehow that was implicated in the causation of bipolar disorder. So he started to think about maybe uric acid was involved in bipolar disorder. And so he wanted to increase the concentration of uric acid and decrease it and do further experiments. Now, to do that is quite tricky chemically. And the way he thought he would do it was that he made uric acid more soluble, which meant that he could use it chemically a little bit more easily. And the way he did that is you add lithium to uric acid. So you have urine, which has uric acid, and you add lithium. And what that creates is a substance called lithium urate, which is the combination of lithium and uric acid. And that's very soluble. which meant that you can either concentrate it and inject it and see what would happen, or make it very dilute and see what would happen. But he was looking at the uric acid side, not the lithium part. The lithium just comes in as an aside.
Yep.
But it seems as he was doing these experiments, as a control, he wondered what would happen if he injected not urine into these guinea pigs, which were all dying, by the way. Every time he injected urine to any guinea pig, they died. He wondered what would happen if he just injected a solution of lithium into the guinea pigs. And that's when everything changed.
Wow.
The guinea pigs stopped dying and they just became extremely calm. And there's this incredible day, a pivotal moment in the history of psychiatry, when his wife remembers, because the doctors and their wives and families used to live on the grounds of the asylum.
Yeah.
So now we're talking 1946, 47, 48. And she remembers one day she was in the kitchen doing the dishes and her husband raced over from the asylum through the door and the fence, came in and said, Jean, that was his wife's name, come and have a look at this, and dragged her back into this little disused kitchen on this this little psychiatry unit where he was doing these experiments, this old kitchen. And he picked up this guinea pig, which he had just injected with lithium. And he picked the guinea pig up, it was alive, and he just turned it on its back. And it just stayed there looking at him quizzically. And he said, that's amazing. He felt he had discovered something that could calm the body down.
Yeah.
Now, he thought that this may act as a calming agent for the many patients around him. So there were 200 patients, all ex-diggers. These are all servicemen from World War I and World War II. Many of them who had schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, all sorts of things. But before he decided to give one of these ex-diggers lithium to see if it would calm them down, he secretly, silently, and certainly without telling his wife, decided to take lithium himself.
That is commitment.
It is commitment, but it also, I think, is a measure of the man, because he was a very honourable person, and I think he would have hated the idea of deliberately harming someone.
Yeah.
So he took the lithium for several weeks, had mild stomach upset, but nothing else, and then thought, this is safe. And so he cast his eye across the asylum grounds, and he picked out a man who was roughly about the age of 50. His name was Bill Brand, who had been in and out of hospitals for a long period of time. Yeah. And he picked Bill out, who had been chronically manic. That means elevated in mood, talking endlessly for many years. He was regarded as, quote, untreatable in the medical notes, because we went back and looked at the original notes. It was Bill that John Cade decided to first try lithium. And in March 1948, Cade stirs a solution of lithium and gives lithium to Bill Brand. And from March through to July of that year, 1948, something really, I think, truly miraculous occurs.
Yeah.
Every hallucination, delusion that Bill had really essentially just evaporates.
Wow.
And by that stage, July, Bill's back to normal. His family are astounded. I think Cade is astounded.
Yeah.
And Cade stirs up the solution, gives it to other patients in the asylum. And those with mania, all of them settled.
Eureka.
That was a moment of triumph in terms of lithium. But of course, as you may be aware, Leon, it was a moment of triumph that was, for a period, relatively short-lived.
What happened?
Because Bill Brand, who was really the flagship of all this experimentation, returned to the asylum. Police were involved, and he was as psychotic as he had ever been. Initially, John Cade was incredibly crestfallen because he had felt that lithium, maybe it wasn't working after all. The key was this, that Bill Brand was feeling remarkably good outside the hospital. He felt he no longer needed lithium, stopped the lithium, and sadly, he relapsed into a psychotic illness. Brought back in by his family and the police, Cade restarted the lithium and got him well again. But his other patients did remarkably well. Numerous other doctors in Melbourne took up the lithium story, started working with it, published, and over a period of time, they worked out what needed to happen with lithium was that, yes, it was very effective in treating bipolar illness, particularly in bringing down that manic state, but you needed to do regular blood tests to measure the level of lithium in the blood to make sure, A, you had enough lithium in the body, but not too much. In other words, you had to have that just within that right window. And still today, in 2021, we use many of those fundamental discoveries made in Melbourne, the late 1940s and early 1950s. And indeed, those discoveries are used all around the world today. And lithium, for the more severe end of the bipolar spectrum, is still the agent of choice.
It sounds like he was such a person with such integrity, such commitment to keep pee in the fridge as well as testing it on himself. If you were to meet John Cade today, what would you say?
There would be a part of me that would just want to thank him.
Yep.
The reason for that is not just that he made this discovery, but it was the harbinger, it was the opening of the world of psychopharmacology. Because in the decade or so after, all the other major groups of drugs, medications we use in psychiatry today were discovered, but lithium was the first. That's
Right.
unfortunate. But the second thing that I would do, Liam, is I would want to know what happened in Changi.
Yeah.
I would want to know what was it about the patient experience that led him to think physical causation was important in psychiatric illness, and then how that led him to this rather unusual set of idiosyncratic experiments using guinea pigs, lithium, and urine, and of course the home fridge, which led to this monumental discovery. Because unfortunately, whilst he was alive, no one actually sat down with John Cade and asked him these questions.
Well, it's an incredible benefit that you've actually found the answers to many of those questions and documented it. And like John Cade, it seems that one of your superpowers is curiosity. And it's with curiosity and with tenacity that we make these incredible discoveries. So I'm really grateful that we had a chance to chat about John Cade and the history of lithium as a psych drug. Thanks for joining me.
Leon, it's been a pleasure, and thank you very much, and good luck with all your own work.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to It's a Minefield. This program has been kindly funded by the Mental Health Commission of New South Wales and broadcast all around Australia on the Community Radio Network. Produced by Caroline Savransky,
Leon Fernandez,
Chris Jager,
with executive producer Jeff Furlow.
You can reach out to us on Instagram and Facebook with the handle It's a Minefield, or get in touch via email info@iamf.org.au.
see you on the flip side, June bugs.
The hillside, it glows like the grass is on fire. Listening to rain pour down on the rooftop, the smell in the air that can't be mistaken. Feeling the salt water cool against your skin as you dive underneath the waves in the ocean. Waking to sunrise when you're